Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another Tabletops and Taverns. In this episode, we're going to continue to take a look at some of the basic elements of RPG and adventure design, with a couple of related things that, once again, can be used in almost any RPG genre. Poisons and diseases. As some of the most insidious threats in real life, they can be encountered in a variety of forms in a wide variety of RPG genres, although the threat that they pose and the ways in which they are introduced may vary widely, depending on whether the setting is a particular type, or the tone of the game, or whatever. Poisons and diseases are similar in that they are both things that can impact the body and potentially be fatal. In game terms, poisons are a catch-all term for natural and artificial poisons and venoms, or even irritants and allergens if they can cause physical distress. Diseases, on the other hand, may encompass actual infections, genetic or other bodily maladies, or even certain strange magical-based illnesses. In many systems, they are treated similarly, although with different severities, durations, and onset times. Some systems, however, may treat them entirely differently from one another. Other systems may simply ignore or drastically reduce the danger of these afflictions. It's understandable why some systems would reduce the severity of poisons and diseases. Perishing from them is not a very heroic way to go. Many games that will focus on cinematic combat or daring deeds simply gloss over these things. On the other side of the spectrum, some games deal with both poisons and diseases with all sorts of qualifiers and modifiers, and may even present rules for exposing characters to them even between sessions. Most games, however, pick a middle road, providing some sort of rules for handling poison or diseases when the characters are exposed to them at least, usually as a result of combat, traps, or exploration. Mechanically, diseases and poisons can be handled in several ways. Many systems treat them both as long-term or duration-based afflictions that reduce a character's ability scores or health, with some method of fighting off the effects. Perhaps a saving throw, perhaps a resistance. It depends. Poisons generally take effect more swiftly, sometimes even instantaneously, while diseases may take days or months to have their effects. Poisons are also more likely to directly reduce health in most systems, while diseases tend to reduce attributes, inhibit certain actions, or similar. Oddly enough, in most moderately dangerous genres, exposure to poison tends to happen more often than disease, with the most common exposure types being venomous creatures, poisoned weapons, or even things that are delivered by traps. This isn't the case every time, of course, but there's probably some sort of reason for that, which I'll get into when discussing diseases. Due to the apparently greater frequency of poisons and the immediate effects that they can have in a combat scenario, let's cover them first. In most games, poisons include natural and organic poisons, venoms, and possibly other toxic chemicals. They are most often encountered as a result of being injured by a poisonous monster, but may also be encountered as part of a trap, a spell, or an artificially poisoned attack, or even as part of the environment. Despite how common poison is in role-playing games in general, how poisons are handled in the rules varies wildly. In fact, I for one am amazed at just how differently various systems handle these. Even Dungeons & Dragons, the system with which I'm most familiar with and which has a relatively consistent feel all the way through, just slowly varying rules as it goes, just completely handles the poison rules differently depending on the edition. In D&D alone, poisons have been instant kill on a failed save, hit point damage instantly on a fail save, ability score immediately and then repeatedly after a fail save, ongoing repeated hit point damage until the save goes off, and hit point damage followed by a debuff effect, etc. And that's just in different editions of one game. Other games, I've seen it treated as an ongoing damage type, ongoing ability score damage, a general if drastic status effect, etc., etc. The problem with such a wide range of implementations across different systems is that it can make it difficult to talk about the role of poison in adventure design in a meaningful manner. With basic weapon damage, even systems that don't use hit points can generally be treated in a similar manner, with encounter design that you go ahead and talk about the various opponent numbers and rolls in a way that's applicable to any system. But with poison, the different implementations can result in much different considerations when a game master is throwing it at the player characters. So for purposes of this video, let's generally divide poison implementations into a few main categories. This is useful not only for talking about poisons across games, but even within the same game if different poison types exist. First, you have your Saveur Die style poisons. These are poisons which, if they land and pass the initial resistance, they disable the character. This can be through actually killing them, paralyzing them, knocking them unconscious, etc. Poisons that provide instant damage on the spot follow, whether they allow a save or not. Then there's poisons that provide a long-term debuff, either by reducing attributes or inflicting some sort of weakening or healing limiting status effect. Finally, there are poisons that inflict repeated damage over time. This can be in the form of health damage or attribute damage or similar mechanisms, just reducing a character's effectiveness or driving them onward towards death until cured or the poison wears off. Each of these types of poison can fill a different role, and they should be approached differently, whether you are running a game or playing the game. The first type, the Saveur Die poisons, are the most straightforward. They have a chance to turn a particular attack into a one-shot kill, and that drastically ups the ante for the combats that it's involved in. Even if it merely puts the target to sleep or paralyzes them, that still effectively removes the target from combat, should they fail to counter it. An adventure design that includes this sort of Saveur Die effect should use them sparingly, unless the party has or can come into possession of a number of ways to protect themselves. If a particular creature has this sort of poison, it would be useful to portray them with bright colors or obvious danger, as is often the case in nature. This is not only in keeping with actual poisonous creatures, but it also gives the player some sort of warning that they should adopt different tactics when they're approaching this particular encounter. There's only so much that can be done about this sort of poison from a player's perspective. If the Saveur Die effect is from combat, then they can try to take steps to not get hit, buffing their evasion or their armor class, or taking advantage of some sort of effect that just negates attacks entirely. If this fails, or if the effect is not from combat, then many times they must do what they can to improve their chances of resisting or saving against that one check. Many systems have some sort of spell or antitoxin that can grant protection against poison effects, either in full or in part. While these are important for all sorts of poisons, it's one of the few ways to work against these sorts of Saveur Die style poisons. Of note is that some systems allow for specific spells to be cast immediately after a character succumbs to one of these things, in order to try to revive them, but this is only if it's done immediately thereafter. In this case, it would behoove the one able to cast such a spell, or one of a similar effect, to go ahead and stay well away from the combat, and just to make sure that they don't get taken out. That way, if somebody else drops, then they can go heal them. When confronted with the instant damage style poisons, the considerations are much the same as the Saveur Die poisons, but somewhat lessened. Extra poison damage on attacks increases the lethality of a particular encounter, trap, or whatever, and its nature makes it hard to deal with simply just not getting it, except for the whole don't get hit kind of thing. However, it doesn't turn into a one-shot kill, and therefore there's a lot more leeway there, either to use such a poison effect in a design or to take a few hits in combat if you're on the player side. In general, the same sorts of tactics that are useful for Saveur Die kind of effects apply here. Where the real role shift for poison use happens is when poisons start having durations. Poisons that either inflict a status effect or reduce ability scores for a duration after initial exposure serve to reduce their target's capabilities. This usually isn't a game-breaking sort of debuff, but it can be noticeable and can interact with other effects that reduce the party's ability. When done right, this can result in a different kind of adventure, either requiring the characters to heal themselves of these status effects or allowing opponents that would ordinarily be on the weak side to pose more of a threat. The latter is especially useful when there's some sort of timing situation that doesn't allow the characters to simply correct the poison's effects. Imagine, if you will, that the characters are poisoned at a banquet, and during that very banquet a notable dignitary is kidnapped. This could force the characters to undergo a chase and rescue without the time to prepare spells or heal the poison through other means. In their weakened state, even ordinary footmen might pose a threat. These sorts of duration-based status poisons are thus handy to use as plot devices. Player characters do have a few options when dealing with these duration-based poisons. First, They can just grin and bear it. If the effects aren't terribly impressive, they could just decide to proceed as normal and just wait it out. Duration-based effects open the door for things like antitoxins, curative spells, healing skill, and so forth, to try to reduce the effects or eliminate them. Alternatively, certain spells could be used to offset the poison's effects without removing them. For instance, if a poison reduces a character's strength, and no cures were on hand, some sort of spell or ability that heightens said character's strength could work to partially cancel out the penalty from the poison. The final type of poison implementation, the ongoing damage and or ability score damage, is perhaps a bit more effective than even the instant death types. With these types of poisons, repeated damage either to health or to ability scores happens on a regular basis until the character dies, manages to outlast the poison, or is cured. While the overall damage is generally not enough to instantly kill the character, this repeated application of the damage can be panic-inducing. I've used this to great effect and found that party members generally scramble to try to cure or heal the damage being inflicted, often using way more resources than they would on a simple Saveur Die type spell, or Saveur Die type poison. In games with magic, where spellcasting requires concentration, repeated damage from poison effects can just shut the caster down entirely. In any event, seeing that character's health drop rapidly can force players to take actions that they ordinarily wouldn't just to try to head it off. As nasty as this sort of repeated damage is, the way that a player can deal with this sort of poison is generally just through the techniques listed above for each of the prior poison types. Don't get poisoned in the first place. Try any curatives that they can once the poison goes into effect, or just try to out-heal the damage as it comes in. Due to the nature of this particular type, it's one of the few types of poison where the players will probably try to go all in and just pour every single resource they have at it. If you're running a game that uses poisons, one thing that you should take into account is whether players have access to those poisons, and if so, by what rules. If you ever let a player character have access to a poisonous animal, chances are really good that they're going to try and milk it for the poison. If they're an herbalist, they've got access to various herbal poisons as well. I'm usually not one to deny my players something if they have a reasonable reason to have access to it, but it does bear consideration. Poison against the party can be an effective way of reducing their overall threat, but if multiple party members actually have poison at their disposal and poison that single enemy, especially in systems that allow poison stacking, it can quickly render that otherwise difficult encounter almost ineffectual. You can handle this in a number of ways, while still allowing the players to enjoy some benefit from using poisons on creatures. I generally try to mix some creatures up. Some are immune to poison, some are not. And there's no way to tell, well, aside from the obvious, until they actually encounter the creatures. There's also the fact that poisons aren't very heroic, and some character types are probably not going to want to just not use them, especially if they're in a setting where legal repercussions exist for the characters. So, given that poisons can be so effective, either against or in service of the player characters, how do diseases stack up with that? In most role-playing games with disease rules, they cover not only communicable illnesses, but also related diseases and other afflictions. In game terms, diseases are long-term debilitating effects that may get worse over time. Generally, much like poisons with a duration, they get worse until either the character fights it off, is cured, or dies. Unlike poisons, diseases tend to happen over a long period of time. Like poisons, diseases in games have a number of different implementations, but the vast majority of them can be described in very similar terms. Generally, a character is exposed to a disease and must see if they catch it, and then over time the disease either gets worse or better depending on the saving throw or resistances or just duration. Many times, diseases reduce ability scores or affect similar ability-reducing debuffs, and only really rarely deliver hit point damage. Some diseases may have certain stages that have additional effects, like blindness, contagion, nausea, that sort of thing. So this sameness means that disease tends to serve a very similar role regardless of the RPG it's in. That is, disease weakens characters over the long term, making them less effective at combat and skills, and may eventually kill them. How you approach that role may vary from game to game and genre to genre. In an heroic campaign, the existence of diseases may only come up when the characters are directly affected by a diseased creature. In others, exposure to disease may come as a result of exploring infected areas, or even as a natural result of exposure in certain climates and terrain. In a really hardcore game, the character may be exposed to a disease just by sitting around town or walking down the street. This is more likely to be the case in a medieval, low fantasy genre game than anything modern. Diseases can be a powerful narrative tool for adventure designers, providing an impetus to get the party out and about, either by afflicting them or NPCs whom they value. In a grittier or darker tone of game, or in a game that relies on survival elements to provide a lot of the challenge, diseases can provide just as much of a challenge as weather or other elements. Disease can be a consequence of certain actions, like tromping around in a sewer while wounded, or battling undead without tending to their wounds afterwards. Exposure to disease can come from a variety of sources, and an adventure designer really should not be afraid to hit the party with multiple diseases if the situation calls for it. All in all, afflictions like poisons and diseases are sometimes overlooked, in fact, often overlooked in a game, usually only brought forth when a particular monster or spell lists them as an effect, and usually that's some sort of poison. If you take anything away from this video, at least from an adventure design perspective, remember that poisons and diseases alike can originate from a number of sources, and exposing the characters of them outside of combat can make for situations every bit as deadly and challenging as a charging orc horde, but without the need for rolling up a single monster. Use them to modify the difficulty of an encounter, to move the story forward, or simply to provide impetus to an adventure. But most importantly, try using them, at least if it's suitable for your game and you haven't already. I hope that my take on these matters has been at least somewhat helpful, and I am going to try to be back soon with more examinations of aspects of RPGs. For now, this has been the RPG Crawler. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content. If you want to get early access to videos like this, or just help support my work in general, check out my Patreon at patreon.com/rpgcrawler, or through the link at the end of the video or in the description below. Until next time, take care and goodbye.